Matan Zamir. Matan is Israel's Deputy Consul General to the Pacific Northwest. He has been a member of Israel's Foreign Service since 2011. He previously served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the Israeli consulates in Mumbai and New England. New England, I'm sure, is in Boston. I think I've heard of that. And he served in the IDF, retired as a lieutenant, was a recipient of the President's Medal of Excellence on the occasion of Israel's 55th Independence Day. That seems so long ago. You don't look that old. And before joining the Foreign Service, Matan was an international business manager at an Israeli telecom, and also worked as the director of training of the training department at the Israeli Supreme Court. He is a Yerushalmi, meaning he is from Jerusalem, 9th generation. That, as they say in Yiddish, is some yichus. He is also a lawyer, a graduate of Hebrew University. That's you did your law degree at Hebrew?
Yes, Hebrew.
Yes. And Hebrew University, local trivia fans will remember, was founded by Yehuda Magnus. And there is an institute in his name just across the bay in Berkeley. So delighted to have you here, Matan. So why don't we dig in on the topic that I'm sure everybody is chattering about right now. Israel just had a 4th round of elections. I can see the excitement on your face.
Right, I was hoping you won't start from there, but let's go.
Okay, well, so here's the thing. So first of all, my sympathy, first of all, because I know successive elections mean that there is no budget in Israel. And when there's no budget in Israel, it means all the people who work for the Israeli government are working with last year's budget, which, courtesy of inflation, is increasingly a smaller budget.
Right.
Having said that, I just thought you would give us a very, and I'm not asking for a political analysis or prognostication, but just sort of where have the pieces landed? Here, we're trying this for the 4th time. Where have the pieces landed? Who are the major players as of this afternoon at 4:05 Pacific time?
All right, thank you for being so accurate, because everything can change exactly in an hour from now. I mean, now they're sleeping, so let's say 10 hours from now. Yes, it's a little hectic. Let me say thank you for hosting me first. For you, the team at Sherith Israel, I have to admit, I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces. Some of them live actually a couple of floors above me. Hi, Joe Beth, and thank you for having me. Okay, you started from the elections. Let me tell you a story. When I was in Boston, because the Israeli government still have not received my idea of opening a consulate at Montclair in Vermont, so it's still in Boston for New England. We had a leader of the Jewish Federation there for 30 years. He now retired, Barry Schreck. And he used to take, I'm sure you've heard the name, it's a very famous name in Jewish life in the US. Been taking delegations of Americans to Israel for many, many years. And for years, those delegations visited the Knesset, our parliament, and learned about Israeli politics and Israeli election system. They kept asking him, what is this crazy system these people have in Israel? Parties, and then they have to form coalition, but then it has to be 4 years. It can be less than 4 years. And then in 2016, when I was in Boston, when President Trump got elected, a lot of Israelis started asking the Americans, what is this crazy system you have here, right? You have a president that's elected with less than a minority, not the popular vote, and less people voted for him than Hillary. And what are those electorates that people are talking? But now I'm proud to say that the tables have turned again back to us, to the crazy system in Israel, because for the first time in our history, in less than 2 years, we had 4 rounds of elections, like you said. April 2019, September 2019, March 2020, and now the last one was March 2021.
You're making the Italians feel good.
I know. Finally, somebody less stable than their system, but it's not for us. Like you said, there's a lot of implications for that. Budgetary, we have what we call a transit budget and not an actual budget. It prevents, other than the IDF, no other ministry or government entity can plan for 2 years, for 5 years, for 10 years. It affects every area of living or every area of governing. For us, and us, the foreign ministry as well, the consulate. As you can see, the light behind me is not turned on because no, I'm kidding. We still have money to turn on the light. We have money to pay salaries, but I have to say not much more than that because we are struggling. 4 rounds of elections in 2 years is not an easy thing. And the problem is the system. On one hand, the fact that for somebody to win, they have to get out of 120 seats that we have in our Knesset, in our parliament, has to get 61, right, to get a majority. And the second, so that's the system. So you have to have a 61 to govern. But then the other half of it is the way that the Israeli public is not just split in half, like it used to be on, let's say, left and right, security, pro-peace, and not anti-peace, but more pro-Israel, Eretz Israel Shema, so not giving up pieces of land, pro-settlement, anti-settlement. That all divine is still, in a way, exists in our political dialogue, but there's a lot more now that divides religious and state, for example. Some ultra-Orthodox parties can only be considered right-wings, and some right-wings party are against the dominance of the Rabbanut in Israel, so religious state is one. But I think even though our system, like I said at the beginning, is very different, the American and Israeli system, the way that we're divided around the identity of our leader, so basically pro-Bibi, anti-Bibi, pro-Prime Minister Netanyahu, anti-Prime Minister Netanyahu, is very similar to the way the American people looked at the image of former President Trump, right? Pretty much down in the middle. So all of that creates this blend of smaller parties in our parliament, 14, 13 different parties in the Knesset that has to find a common ground that they do agree on and form a coalition.
No easy task.
Yes.
And by the way, the chat is open, so you can chat to me. So if you have questions, I will happily try and get to them. I just, given that Matan is here, and when you host somebody from the Israeli government, it becomes a little bit of a lightning rod. For security reasons, we just locked the chat down. So if you, showed up thinking, oh, I'm going to chat with Greg, I'm picking on you, Greg, because I can see you right there at the top of my screen. I'm sorry, but feel free to pick up the phone and call Greg later. So let's go to some more uplifting Israeli news. COVID, which is not a particularly uplifting story. So there was a story I read today that Bhutan is now the most immunized country in the world, having just squeaked ahead of Israel on a percentage basis. But all that, that said, Israel has done a remarkable job in immunizing its population relatively rapidly, which isn't to say there weren't some ups and downs over the last year, as many countries experienced, but curious as to sort of your observation of that.
Yeah, if you see the international graphs of percentage of vaccines out of the population, you see Israel, and then you see those Bhutanese in the last week going nuts. I mean, they're much smaller countries with much less people, but obviously I'm very happy for them. But I mean, COVID, like you said, it's not good news, but the trend in Israel is actually amazing. I was fortunate to go to Israel after a year and a half. This was the longest that I've been outside of my country since I can remember. For Pesach, I spent Pesach in Israel, and I have to say the feeling walking down the streets is, other than the fact that people are still wearing masks, and I was surprised because Israelis tend to be loosey-goosey with the law in general, right?
Seatbelts, smoking, all that stuff.
Yeah, but the people were wearing masks. I was expecting, because coming from here, from San Francisco, where you see 90% of people are wearing their mask and actually covering their noses. So Israelis do tend to have this problem with the noses still, but they are wearing masks. So that was great. But now, as of this coming Sunday, this mandatory mask outdoors, the fact that you have to wear a mask outdoors is actually going to be lifted. So, and there's a lot of positive trends happening in Israel, a lot of changes. they have closed most of the COVID departments in hospitals in Israel. In the peak of the pandemic, I think it was either November or December, there were more than 1,200 critical COVID patients all over Israel. That is almost the capacity of our health system. Now this number is less than a quarter, so 350 people, out of them less than 200 in critical condition. Out of the 76,000 COVID tests they did yesterday, today's, like you said, is Memorial Day, Yom Ha'atzmaut, and then Independence Day, so they did less. But yesterday, on Tuesday, they did 776,000 tests. 199 came back positive, so less than 0.3%. So the numbers are amazing. We know like we said at the beginning, more than 4.9 million people got the vaccine. If you add to that almost 800 or a little over 800,000 people who got COVID, who tested positive for COVID, and the kids who are under 12, because we're going to start vaccinating the 12 to 16 kids, the teenagers soon, you really left with a very small number of people with either health conditions or unfortunately anti-vaxxers or people like that, but very, very, very small numbers. So you go to Israel, the education system is going to be back at full capacity this coming Sunday as well. All classes, all physical, no capsules. So you see a great trend. And what people in Israel used, people who got the vaccine used to, and their method of enjoying all of this is what we call the Green Pass or the Green Passport, right? Which is an app on your phone that you go everywhere with, you show it, and you go into a restaurant, you go into concerts. Concert for Yom Ha'atzmaut now, concerts are everywhere happening. Sports events, shopping malls. So really, really nice to feel you feel normal again.
Right.
So that's very exciting.
Right. So one of the things, is the discussion around vaccine passports in the United States is very much centered on, you can't make me do that. Now, having lived in Israel for a while, I understand that Israelis also have a you can't make me do that attitude. But I'm curious as to around this issue, if you see that differently, or are people sort of like, okay, fine, if this is the price of admission, I'll pay it, or are the people who are like, absolutely not, you can't make me do anything?
What I found, and I think it's not that different in Israel, like you said, in Israel and here in the United States, is that those people that object to either the vaccines or whatever, even though they're small in number, they tend to be very, very loud. So you hear them a lot, especially on social media. Some of them even go out to protest. I can't say it's a large group of people, and I can't say they have they've managed to find a way into they're far away from the mainstream Israeli point of view. And so that's but you hear them. When I was in Israel now for 10 days, and I was in Tel Aviv is a green city, so you can go, and then Jerusalem is a green city, Haifa is a green city, Bnei Brak, an ultra-Orthodox city is a green city. I haven't seen anything other than on social media that can be like, oh, this is a phenomenon of people objecting, the vaccines or objecting. Because people tend to understand that this vaccine is something very, like a nice anecdote from today. You know how we have this ceremony on Mount Herzl. So everybody who's been to Israelis, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the ceremony. That's kind of like the vision between mourning while Yom HaZikaron during Memorial Day, which was today here and yesterday in Israel, and then the celebration of Independence Day. That's the ceremony from Jerusalem, from Mount Herzl. I don't know if you've seen it. There's an iconic thing that every Israeli knows, is that we have this kind of army brigade or army patrol that they do this every year. They do like a Magen David, or they'll do a menorah. They'll do like symbolic stuff with the flags, with themselves, like they'll shape up some. And this year, it was really funny. I'm sure you can find it online. They did the shape of syringe and the shape of an arm. Like, I don't know, 200 people did the shape.
Right, so it's like a marching band, at halftime.
Exactly. Yeah, marching band, exactly, like a marching band with flags, and they did it. And the syringe was able to move twice to signify the 2 doses of, which is really funny. It's a really funny, yeah, they did a really good job.
That's great. That's great. So I just, for people's reference, the total population of Israel, exclusive of the occupied territories, is about 8 million plus minus people, which is either roughly the Bay Area or New Jersey, take your pick. So if you want to think of Israel as New Jersey with France's army, you know, there's a question in the chat about changing the electoral system. I'm not aware of any serious proposals. There was back in the 90s a short-lived run of direct election of prime minister. That proved to be, they thought it would root out the small parties. And in fact, it created more small parties because people split their votes. But it's all at large. There's no districts. There's no geographical sort of like red state, blue state kind of thing. You know, people live sort of next door to each other and vote differently, with the exception of the ultra-Orthodox communities, which even this year, actually, that was sort of interesting, that this is what I read anyway, that a number of the ultra-Orthodox didn't vote for the ultra-Orthodox parties, but a number of the younger folks voted for some of the other right-wing parties.
Right.
Is that reflective of what you had seen as well?
Yes, your answer is 100%. There's been talk about changing the system, but and there was this one attempt that you mentioned in 1999 when Ehud Barak actually won against Netanyahu, when people voted in two notes, not just the note of a party that we do today, just the letters of the party that you want to vote for, but also a name of a prime minister. So then people, like you said, were able to split, and then it created even more a chaotic parliament with 20 parties rather than 10 or 12 or 13. So they changed it. There's always some type of conversation in the academia and then on the press about changing the system, but nothing too serious to mention.
Right. All right. Well, so let's pivot again. So the Abraham Accords, as they are named, or for those of us who are not so enamored with titles given out by the former president, Israel's opening with the Gulf states, and very curious to sort of get your take, or at least the ministry's take. What does this mean, right? I can remember going to Jordan in 1996, and in 1996, to be in Jordan as Israeli was to be welcomed in as a guest, in a way that I imagine is not true today. Things have soured. But in 1996, I remember being in the back of a cab, driving across town with an Arab friend of mine, and the driver started speaking to us in Hebrew. And, I looked at my friend Ibrahim and I'm like, I'm not getting involved in this. And we started talking. Now, he learned Hebrew from watching Israeli television, and it turned out he was Ibrahim's cousin, which they figured out in about 30 seconds. Like, oh, where are you from? Ramla. Is your mother so-and-so? Oh, yeah, that's my sister's aunt. Right. So, but I'm curious, like, are Israelis like going to Dubai for shopping trips? Like, what's going on with all of that?
Oh yeah. So you touched upon like an interesting point, because people refer to our peace with Egypt as more of like a cold peace, even though there's a lot going on in trade and in security coordination and fighting human trafficking and fighting smuggling on our border with Egypt down south, and now recently, unfortunately, a little more with Jordan, even though there's a lot going on in Jordan internally. I'm sure you've read about the last week, let's say, it's not drama, but the relationship within the royal family in Jordan. But there's a lot going on with Jordan. With UAE, I will risk and say from day one, the relationship has been, and after 26 years of no peace, or no additional peace agreement between Israel to any of our regional neighbor or regional countries, because the last one was like you've mentioned, with Jordan in 1994. We signed the Abraham Accords. Started with the United Arab Emirates, then Bahrain, then Sudan, and now Morocco, and hopefully more countries will join. And just for this call to this today, I've gathered a list of stuff that happened this week between Israel as follow-up for the Abraham Accords. One of them, it's really funny, is the this week, the Emirati ambassador landed in Israel for the first time, which was really exciting. Was accepted at the foreign ministry, and one of the first things he did, he went to you mentioned that I'm a Jerusalemite, so he went to my favorite falafel place in Jerusalem, ate falafel with like a really nice 3-piece suit that stayed clean. That was a miracle.
He didn't get a Moravi or Shami? Nobody told him?
No,
Like
he got falafel. Yeah, that's a good point. But he got falafel in like a really nice place in Jerusalem, and joined the meeting at the foreign ministry. So that's an exciting. We already have our ambassador in Abu Dhabi, Consul General in Dubai. There's an ambassador charged the affairs in Bahrain, and same in Morocco. So the diplomatic ties are getting stronger. The first Etihad flight, commercial Etihad flight, the national flight company from the Emirates landed in Israel this week as well. And on the cultural business cyber tech, which is an Israeli cyber conference this year for the first time, was hosted at Dubai by the Emirati. On all government, and Ichilov, a hospital, an Israeli hospital opened their branch in Dubai. All branches of government, transportation. This is a long list that can take forever just for me reading it. But to answer your question, in 6 months, and put the COVID as a factor, over 150,000 Israelis already traveled to UAE. They're looking into 7 weekly flights from Etihad. Dubai Air will join. El Al will join. So the fact that people want to go, and then also Emiratis visit Israel. Emirati, I mentioned, because in UAE, there's 10% who are actually Emirati, and then 90% are more foreign workers. A lot of them are Indians, but people from the UAE want to see Israel and vice versa. So that's really exciting. Yeah.
Interesting. I remember a phenomenon when I was in Amman that there were a lot of folks from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and I was told that they came to Amman because it was a little more liberal. Like you could get a beer in Amman, you couldn't get a beer in Riyadh. So it was like, and Lebanon at the time was not considered safe anymore, so they came to Amman. So it'll be interesting to see if you start to see people from the Gulf states on the beaches of Tel Aviv, because it's a little more liberal and they can get a beer.
Right. I mean, but they can get a beer in Dubai. So Dubai is not right. But you're right, because in like Sudan, for example, there's and you mentioned Saudi Arabia. When between 2013 and 2015, I was posted in Mumbai at our consulate in India in Mumbai. I remember flying. When I was there, we had to fly only with El Al, and only around Saudi Arabia. A flight that could theoretically took 5 hours took more than 8 hours because we had to go all around, south. And I mean, even though we don't have any formal relations with Saudi Arabia yet, the fact that they've allowed Israeli El Al carrying Israeli flag, commercial planes flying across Saudi Arabia to India and to the east is a huge progress, period, for the Israel-Saudi Arabia relationship.
Right. And for those of us old enough to remember, during the Reagan administration, the huge fight over selling airborne radar systems, the AWACS, to the Saudis. I'm sure we can sort of think through like, wow, that's been a real sea change. The closest I've gotten to Saudi Arabia is standing on Har Safakot, which is outside of Eilat, and you can see Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
But that's about it.
Right.
Interesting. So one of the things that people have talked about in terms of this reconciliation, especially with the Gulf states, less so with places like Morocco and Sudan, but especially with the Gulf states, is it's all about Iran, right? That the Gulf states are essentially making a calculation that their interest lies in aligning themselves with Iran's greatest enemy because they perceive Iran as their enemy as well. And I'm, curious as to your take or the ministry's take on that dynamic.
Right. One more thing I wanted to add to the previous question that I think is even more important than business and tourism is that for the first time, the Emirati government hosted a Yom HaShoah, a Holocaust Memorial Day ceremony in Dubai last week. Same in Bahrain, and same in Morocco. So, and it was huge. I think there's a recording of it online. So, cultural, but also this connection that through education, through these type of ceremonies, through these types of events, you can really build. Then you can really understand each other's mindset and history. And then to answer your question, Iran is aggressive in the Middle East, period. We spoke with, yesterday we had an event with our Consul General in Dubai, and I asked him that question about the Iran aggression, and was that a factor in the closeness now that we see through the Abraham Accord between Israel and some of the Gulf countries. And he said it's a factor, but Iran's been aggressive for decades now, since 1979. There's a lot going on internally in Iran, a lot of positive elements, but a very ruthless, cruel regime that's been arming itself. The JCPOA, the Iran deal, or the nuclear plan, is only one element. The exact missiles program, the battles, the things that have been happening in Yemen and in Lebanon through Hezbollah, or through the Houthis in Yemen, destabilizing the entire region, and supporting terror. Iran is the number one country in the world that sponsors terrorists directly and through proxies. I'm happy to say that just something that happened today, again on the news side of things, is that for the first time in 8 years, the European Union, who's sitting in Vienna with the P5+1 to negotiate the reopening the Iran deal, has launched sanctions on 8 Iranian, very, very senior Iranian officers this week, who are involved in direct sponsorship or promoting terror. That's something that, like I said, hasn't happened in 8 years, because I think even the European understand that something is happening in Iran, and it's not happening it's not a good trend of more radicalization and perhaps showing muscles as a negotiation tool, but definitely destabilizing the region and the world.
Right. And, is Israel looking at the upcoming Iranian elections with any sense of optimism or increased pessimism for that matter?
So with those elections, it's unfortunate. It's between radical to more radical to very radical, right? So some of the leaders who are elected are, at least in the way that they speak, they present themselves as pro-West and more reasonable to negotiate with. But in the bottom line, it's the Revolutionary Guard that have the control of the streets and the people, and the Ayatollahs who rule everybody else, including the government.
Right. So I guess the other piece of this, and it just struck me as I'm looking down my list of questions, like, oh, I have not asked you about the Palestinian situation at all. And I think it's reflective of the fact that it's sort of faded to the background to some degree in Israeli society, right? Like, it's there, but it's not what it was, certainly not what it was in the 90s in the Oslo period. Like, it was the conversation. And during the Second Intifada, it was very much a conversation, albeit a different conversation. And the last time I was in Israel, I was really struck by the absence of that. And it was just a couple of years ago, 2 years ago. Yeah. So I'm curious as to what your experience has been, and also, as you are the face of Israel, or one of the faces of Israel here, to what degree that is the conversation that people expect to have with you, especially outside of the Jewish community.
Thank you. I have to send this recording to my mom, because once you call me a face of Israel, she'll be very happy. But to answer your question,
It's a punam.
So two things. I think it's clear that there is frustration in the Palestinian side, and for two reasons. One, what we've talked about, the last thing we talked about, the Abraham Accords. For many years, I think since 1994, there was this notion that Israel cannot move forward and sign peace agreement and get to any agreements with any other Arab or Middle Eastern country without going through Ramallah, right? Without going through the Palestinian and solving the Palestinian conflict. And I think the Abraham Accord, the four agreements in 6 months, has proven that's no longer the case. And I can tell you, I can't name countries, because I don't know, they don't tell us. Diplomats tend to talk a lot, but also because it's something that hasn't, it's not in fruition yet. But this is one reason that the Palestinians are frustrated, because it's no longer, they don't have a veto anymore of Israel's bilateral relations with other neighboring Middle Eastern countries. And I think the second reason is what we see internally, and that relates to your very first question. We see now more Arab Israelis, because Israel has 20% Arab population within Israel. More Arab politicians, Arab sheikhs, Arab religious leaders who say, we want to be part of the Israeli society. We are Israelis. We are part of this country. Yes, we have disagreements, but we want to go into more. We want to be a key player in the Israeli political game, but we also want to be in mainstream television in Israel. And we see more Israeli Arab TV hosts and Israeli Arab singers and Israeli Arab, like I said, politicians. For example, Arabs are very, very prominent in the healthcare system in Israel, Israeli Arabs. They're 20% of the population. I think 37% of nurses and 35% doctors. So they're very, and especially this year under COVID, they took a very significant role in helping together, alongside their Jewish and Druze and Cherkessi friends, Christian friends, to fight COVID. So the Palestinians are frustrated. There's also internal political conflicts between the different parties within the Palestinians themselves, Hamas and Fatah. There's a rift between the West Bank and Gaza internally. All of that, and Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, is not getting younger. He's in his mid-80s. So all in that together creates this frustration among the Palestinians. Hopefully, this will lead to a good place of understanding that there's a new trend in the Middle East. There's a new order. There's a new way to do things. I'm always optimistic. This has been perhaps because of COVID, but this has been let's say the safest year, or the year with the least casualties or injured in terror attacks in Israel since 73 years since Israel was founded. So there's room for optimism.
And it's interesting what you say about that degree of assimilation, right? And it's I think for American Jews, the notion of assimilation is usually one, or at least for folks of my generation and older, assimilation was the boogeyman. Like, we worried about assimilation. Would your children be Jewish? Would your grandchildren be Jewish, right? The joke was the bottom line of Jewish education is Jewish grandchildren. And as long as you tell the donor that up front, they'll be happy to open their wallets. For Israeli Arabs, assimilation means assimilating into Jewish culture. Which is a really interesting dynamic. I mean, so I had friends in Ramla, Christian Arabs, and Samir's kids went to Israeli schools. Their Hebrew was flawless. Walking down the street, the body language, the clothing, everything, you could not pick them out from the other Israeli high school students. Today, they are small business owners and they're in their 30s, and they are Israelis, full stop. And it's just a fascinating, right? For diaspora Jew, this is a fascinating thing, right? Yeah. And I don't know that this has happened in a millennia, right? Since the Roman days, where non-Jews are being assimilated into Jewish culture in this manner. So that's fascinating. I did want to ask you, so I see Marwan Barghouti is running for the president of the Palestinian Authority. He is in an Israeli prison cell in Ramla. I'm curious as to whether or not there is chatter, amongst Israelis about what this means, because he's challenging Abbas, right. And ostensibly they are from the same political party.
You're right. Like I said, Abbas is not getting younger. There's a lot of candidates that position themselves as the heirs to the Palestinian leadership. I think you're right. Barghouti is perhaps the most popular of those. Perhaps because he's sitting in a prison in Israel after being convicted of terror, of murdering Israeli people in the past. But there's no answer to this. It's at this point, I can say it's chaotic. Every day when I follow the news, there's another frontrunner, or I mean, Abbas is not going anywhere. And I mean, something that we can say now they're now revolving around election procedure.
Mm-hmm.
And how and whether the people who live in East Jerusalem will be able to vote, and if yes, who will monitor them. And so there's a lot of election procedure talk happening these days. But there's a few candidates. There's going to be elections in the West Bank soon. I don't know about Gaza. Hamas is a terror organization that took Gaza by force, so I don't see them.
Right, and there hasn't been an election in the West Bank, I think, since 2001 or something like that. It's been
I think
a long
in Gaza
time.
it was 2006, but
yeah,
I think
you might be right.
Yeah, yes, after right.
Yeah, just it's fascinating to see how that has resolved itself. And the interlocking issue is the question of the Israeli settlements. And so here's a question I have, right? So there was a time when we used to talk about, Yisrael b'Shlema, right? The greater land of Israel, the full land of Israel. And it was this idea that Israel should be a continuous political entity from, to the river to the sea, right? Or vice versa, right? From the Mediterranean to the Jordan. Although some people would tell you the east bank of the Jordan also, right? If you read the Torah. I feel like that conversation has shifted, right? So back in the 90s, people were like, there can never be a Palestinian anything in the land of Israel. And my impression now is there's sort of like okay, there is a Palestinian something, and now we're arguing about the contours of that. Is that your impression as well?
So the Prime Minister, Netanyahu said in 2009 already in the famous Bar Ilan speech, recognizing, two states for two people. And now I agree with you. I think if you let's say, if you ignore the extremes on both sides, even though like you said before, they can be maybe the most vocal. If you look at the Israeli consensus, the middle, both middle right, middle and middle left, there are still very important core issues to resolve. But in terms of having a Palestinian state in this form or the other, I think there's an agreement among the Israelis. But I think the issue now, let's say in the last 2 or 3 years, the deeper issue is what you said before, is the fact that the Palestinian issue in general used to be front row in any discussion, in any political, in an election campaign. Now is, COVID obviously, but also the Abraham Accords, Iran, religion and state, and then the Palestinian issue is not going anywhere, right? The 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank are still there, and 2 million Palestinians, they're still in Gaza. But the issue is because of the many Israelis believe that every time there was a real attempt most Israelis believe that every time there was a real attempt to negotiate with the Palestinians, and I'm not the first one to say it, they don't miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, right? They said no to Olmert, they said no to Sharon, to Barak, and it goes back to Oslo. And so at this point, I think there's, how we have Zoom fatigue. So there's this fatigue in Israel from trying again and again and again. And as long as there's security, and as long as there's some sort of form of stability, this current silence or this current situation is pretty much preserved.
Right. It's almost sort of like the unanticipated effect of the security barrier. I remember when, the security barrier was like, so during the second Intifada, there was this push, right? My friends used to jokingly call it Homa Akshav, right? Like, build a wall now, right? It was crazy that, a Palestinian terrorist could just wander out of Ramallah on foot, and find their way, into Jerusalem, into Ramla, wherever, right? And they said, look, there should at least be a fence. And the idea was that it would sort of like, and the right wing in Israel at the time was very much against it, because they said, well, that's going to become a border, and that's going to create the thing that we don't want, which is a Palestinian state. And then everything on the other side of that fence, every settlement on the other side of that fence, then becomes subject to evacuation, much the way ultimately Gaza was evacuated. But like, I think to some degree, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, that security barrier, because it separated the two populations very effectively, means that the terrorism diminishes, as you mentioned, and therefore it's not the thing in the front of people's brains anymore. Suddenly, it's the question of like, why isn't Yossi going to the army, right? Or, why is the traffic so bad, or any number of other concerns floats up, and then that drives the politics.
Yeah, I think that's I mean, I'm here in the United States, when you say a fence or a wall, it has some bad connotation to it. But when you talk about this fragile situation in Israel, and people, those of you who have been to Israel, I'm sure they know what I'm talking about, the fact that it's intertwined. And when we had this very sad, very long wave of terror attacks during the 90s and then early 2000s, that security fence had to be, like you said, we had to find a solution to secure the Israelis. So that's a factor. Even though I have to say, every day there's more than 100,000 Palestinians who enter Israel, because the Palestinian economy is very much dependent on the Israeli economy. All of them, by the way, got more than 120,000 of them got vaccinated in Israel. So there's still a lot of Palestinians who enter every day through the different checkpoints into Israel. Look, the situation on the ground is far, far from being perfect for anybody, for the Israelis or for the Palestinians. But I think it's the least of many evils to find a way to allow Palestinians to work in Israel, to allow the Palestinian economy to continue to flourish. There's quite a few areas of trade and commerce and industry that are what we call Ezor Tasiyah Mishutaf, so a mutual Palestinian-Israeli industrial zone. So there's projects, but it all boils down back to what we talked about before, which is there's still, and by the way, there's still security coordination on the ground happening on a very, a lot of it and on a daily basis, but it all boils down to the issues of trust and going back to the table, negotiating again, having the Palestinian Authority stop giving monthly salaries to families of terrorists, for example. So there's still a lot going on the ground.
And what is your sense, with a new presidential administration here? And I don't know that we've heard a lot from the Biden administration on this subject, but I'm, curious, like what is it from your perspective that you and your colleagues are sort of hearing or looking for as this new State Department team slowly coalesces?
Hard to say. I think they're still forming. I think it's going to be something definitely different than what we saw in the last 4 years.
Yeah, you could say that about anything in American government.
Right. And I think also different than what we saw during the 8 years of the Obama administration. I think they're going to form their own take on Middle East in general. The American Secretary of Homeland Security is actually now in Israel for his first international travel. Visited Yad Vashem for Yom HaShoah. I think he just left maybe yesterday.
Right.
So
and the Defense Secretary was just there.
Sorry, Defense. Yes. Starting to. I think definitely President Biden himself and a lot of the senior administration, Kamala Harris included, and many others are very familiar with Israel, have, decades of experience with talking to Israelis, talking to Palestinians. So there's a lot to expect. I think there's going to bond what we call in Israel the special relationship, the fact that Israel is the number one ally, friend of Israel in the world, is not going to change at all. I just read, the last thing I read before jumping into this call is the statement that Speaker Pelosi released today. I encourage you to follow her on Twitter or on our social media. Just a very warm blessing for Israel for its 73rd Independence Day. So I think from Senate to Congress to the House to the administration, and the security branches both in Israel and here, those ties are very, very, very deep, and it goes back generations. So I don't see any, thank God, right? I don't see any change happening anytime soon.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that I did see that was pointed out was this is the first administration that hasn't sort of said, okay, we have a special envoy, for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or somebody who's like, this is their right. Jared Kushner, and you go back to Dennis Ross, right? And further back into history, that was the tradition, right? A new administration came in and they're like, we're going to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem, go. And it almost seems like the Biden administration is like, yeah, okay, you know what? We got a bunch of stuff on our plate. I'm wondering if that's sort of like the feeling on your side, or if you're just sort of like, well, that's always window dressing and fine.
My side is San Francisco, so they don't share the.
Okay.
No, but I agree with you. I think the approach of this current administration is more to not to jump into, rather than to learn and really get the full perspective. And now getting some decisions. So we saw the decision of selling the F-35, the approval of continuing with the deal with the UAE, for example, selling the F-35 and not relocating the embassy, for example. Some people speculated on that. So there's a lot of decisions that were already made, but it's very early. COVID is dominating everything these days. So we should wait, I think, a few months before we can jump into any conclusions. But I'm very, very, very optimistic. I think we have friends in the White House, friends on the Hill. So there's no reason to be friends in San Francisco. Maybe let me jump, if that's okay with you, Gordon, to something that, because if I forget mentioning it, I'll be punished by a lot of people.
Yeah, go ahead. Pitch your movie.
We have mentioned Yom Ha'atzmaut a few times. So for those of you who are not 100% Zoom fatigue for today, we have a very special event happening this evening. It's at 7 p.m. And I don't know if you got to see, last year we had the City Hall here in San Francisco, I think for the first time. So nobody contradicted me. So I keep saying for the first time until somebody will show me evidence from like the 70s or the 80s. But for the first time last year, we were able to lit the City Hall in blue and white. So we're going to do the same tonight, because tonight is the eve of Independence Day. So in City Hall, it's going to be lit in blue and white. And then for the first time now I can say it with confidence, Koi Tower as well. So we're going to have a live 7 p.m. It's on the Consulate's Facebook page. I can also share the link with you, but it's going to be on the Facebook Consulate Facebook page. A live, short, 45 minutes, just to show City Hall, show Koi Tower, and then for 20-something minutes, we're going to have some leaders of the community here, from the Federation and from AJC and from JCRC, going to take us on a quick virtual tour of Israel, from the Galilee, Masada, Akko, to all the way to Eilat and Masada and the Negev, all the way south. So fun event, short. So I know how people can be like zoomed out at 7 p.m., but that could be a fun event to celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut and actually get the chance to kind of visit Israel for a short, less than an hour kind of event.
Right. And it's probably worth pointing out that San Francisco and Haifa are sister cities. And I know there have been some joint projects in the past, including there was this sort of wild Periscope art project down at Pier 38 or something like that. I can't remember now. Anything interesting on that front these days?
So yes, thank you for mentioning. So at the event tonight, we actually have a very special greetings from both Mayor London Breed and the Mayor of Haifa, Einat Kalish Rotem, and it's co-sponsored by the San Francisco Haifa Sister City Committee. So yes. So the San Francisco Haifa is a component of the event tonight. So and we're working with the Sister City Committee too. We had a very nice event 2 months ago between the Haifa Museums and the Contemporary Jewish Museum here in San Francisco. They presented the Levi Strauss exhibition that was, I think they're still there, kind of an online virtual tour of that exhibition. And the Haifa Museum of Art and Tolerance presented an exhibition about the history of the LGBTQ community in Haifa. So we had this event, and there's more programs coming between San Francisco and Haifa. So, and it's all on the consulate social media and on our newsletter. So if you're not,
do you have so if you have a chance to pop the, we can get the link. I don't know, Peter, if you can find that link and throw it in the chat for folks, that'd be great. I'm trying to make him juggle through things. Now, I have to ask you, when we talked about Haifa, I don't know if you saw this article in the New York Times. Do you know what I'm going to ask you about? Apparently, Haifa is overrun with wild pigs.
Oh.
Can you tell me anything about that?
Yeah, I can comment. Haifa is let's say between Haifa and Rishon LeZion, Haifa has the upper hand because Rishon LeZion is overwhelmed with hyenas. So
hyenas?
I don't know. Yeah,
in Rishon.
In Rishon, and some of them are actually carrying wild pigs in their. So we can stop here if you want, but there's this. I think it has to do again with COVID. Yes, COVID allowed. When I was in Mumbai, for 2 years there was this legend about tigers roaming around neighborhoods in Mumbai, and now during COVID, a lot of people actually spotted and took pictures of those tigers. So wildlife during COVID in the cities, actually, and Haifa is a really good example because there's dozens of wild pigs roaming around Haifa. They're trying to chase or trying to hunt or whatever they're trying to do to them. Not kill, but take them out of the city to maybe a more rural area for them, more suitable for them. But yeah, this is happening all over Haifa. Last time I was in Haifa, true story, I went to the Haifa Film Festival. I parked my car in Haifa. I opened the door, and right in front of me, outside my driver's side door, I saw this huge peacock with his tail open up. So I guess traveling to Haifa, you get to see a lot of wildlife.
All right. I mean, we have mountain lions, and that's the thing that everybody's like, oh, I saw a mountain lion. Oh, is it really a mountain lion or just a bobcat? So hyenas, interesting.
Yeah.
That is wild. I did not know about that. It's just, I'm like, where in Rishon? It's all suburbs.
Right. I'll send you the piece. It was, and with stripes and all, and a big hyena. I have across the street from my house. There's a lot of those they look like wolf. I'm blanking on the name.
Coyotes.
Coyotes. Yes.
Yeah.
I am now I'm friends with the family of coyotes here in San Francisco.
Well, there you go. It's all about diplomacy, right?
Right. My little dog is not a big fan of them, but they're here, and they're everywhere.
That's great. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This has been wonderful and great fun. And hopefully when the building reopens, we can invite you back in person and we can have another conversation. So hoping
thank you, Gordon.
That'll be.
I do want to thank you. I want to mention that last year, right before COVID, you were very instrumental in organizing together with us a Memorial Day service at Sherith Israel, which was supposed to happen exactly like today last year, but COVID prevented it from happening. So I want to thank you for that and for hosting me today. Hopefully, like you said, sooner than next Independence Day, we could all get together.
Merupa Yemeno.
Yes, amen to that.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Of course, Friday night brings Shabbat services. I hope to see you all then. Bring your friends and enjoy. If you can make it to the consulate's event, the link is in the chat for those of you who can see the chat. Again, thank you all so much for taking some time out of what is otherwise a lovely sunny day.
Thank you.
Okay, Kol Tuv.